Good morning, Mrs. Taylor. Miss Graham.
Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to return, first of all, to some matters regarding the 2014 conduct regulations again. Let's look at your statement, SBPI 00546, please. This is your response to the Rule 8 request. And I'd like to look at paragraph 4. And you'll see here you're talking about in 2019 and 2020.
Yes.
And yesterday you explained you joined Police Scotland in 2018.
Yes.
And then you were appointed shortly after to the position of designate DCC.
Yes.
And so this is you describing the steps you were taking the year after you joined and the year after that.
Yes.
And you say you spoke with many Black and Asian colleagues through focus groups set up by Semper Scotland. Police Scotland created an action plan to address issues they raised, which included support through the training and probationary period, access to training courses, recognising their exposure to microaggression, issues that were not necessarily conduct or discipline related, more often around organisational culture. And I'm interested in that phrase there about exposure to microaggression, issues that were not necessarily conduct or discipline related. Are you suggesting there that microaggression would not necessarily be treated as a conduct or discipline matter at that stage?
So I think if we take that sentence in its entirety, we're also talking about the experiences that not exclusively, but often younger Black and Asian colleagues were experiencing in Police Scotland. And that sat for me very much in the space of the institutional racism declaration that Sir Ian made, and our determination to be an anti-racist organisation. Because for instance, example would be younger Black and Asian colleagues weren't always having or getting access to the training courses and the support that white colleagues were taking for granted at the very start of their career. Now, on an individual basis, that might just be one sergeant making a decision about the career progression of one member of their team. However, on an organisational basis, there was a theme emerging. So from an institutional perspective, what were we doing in Police Scotland to aggregate all of these instances of individual police officers and members of police staff not receiving the grounding and the foundation that they required within our organisation to ensure that they had equity of opportunity progressing their careers with their white colleagues. So that for me is an institutional issue, because actually what I needed was to ensure that divisional people boards were actually checking up on the distribution and dissemination of locally controlled training courses. Now, when we get into the issues of microaggression, as you asked, Council, those can span anything from not sitting beside somebody in a canteen, and that was a set of circumstances which was described to me on a number of occasions. A Black or Asian officer would go and they would have their lunch, and they would find they were sitting on their own. There were issues described to me of colleagues saying, well, where are you from? Well, I'm from Scotland. Yeah, but where are you from? Because you're Black. So those are the type of microaggressions, actually. Now, anything more significant than that, racially abusive language. And again, there were experiences brought to my attention around religious and racially aggravated, hatred being evinced towards our colleagues. And that is absolutely in the discipline space. The issue for me in terms of potentially conduct or organisational culture, and we've heard, and indeed Council referenced in her interim submission, that one of the kind of key almost light bulb moments for me from being at the inquiry previously was the fact that the equality, diversity and inclusion training that we were giving our colleagues wasn't always sticking. It was almost a sort of tick box exercise. So this for me is about actually doing a number of things. First of all, it's ensuring, in terms of dealing with microaggressions, it's ensuring that every colleague within Police Scotland understands what their responsibilities are, both in terms of the Equalities Act, but also in terms of our core values, the code of ethics, and indeed, as we discussed yesterday, the standards of behaviour. And we did that through an EDI training module, which was absolutely mandatory for everybody in Police Scotland. And I think when I retired, about 96% of the organisation had completed that training module. Now, again, in terms of intervening to first of all, recognise, and this is an issue, again, that many Black and Asian colleagues raised with me, that their colleagues didn't recognise the effect that their behaviours were having on Black and minority ethnic colleagues. Now, from my perspective, it's not about effect, it's about impact. And there was clearly an impact being had on numbers of my Black and ethnic minority colleagues because of the unwitting behaviours that were being evidenced towards them by some, and certainly not all, and certainly not the majority, but by some of their white colleagues. So when I'm talking about microaggressions, I am talking about the, those day-to-day occurrences which take, and this is where professional standards needed to have that additional training to understand implicit bias better, to understand the necessity to aggregate sets of circumstances as opposed to taking one, to a white police officer, probably relatively innocuous incident on its own. So there was a suite of activity taken forward, Council, to ensure that we organisationally understood the impact that these seemingly minor actions towards Black and minority ethnic colleagues were actually having on our colleagues. You might take them individually and say, well, actually, they don't meet the threshold for any conduct because, not sitting beside somebody, that's very hard to determine why that should be, but the person who's not being sat beside knows. So it's about impacting on the culture of the organisation. The other aspect to that as well, then, is the training that we need to provide to first and second line managers, who are the individuals who are going to be in the briefing room, they're going to be in the canteen, they're going to be speaking to their team or their shift, to ensure that those leaders and the first and second line managers, I can't stress strongly enough how important the leadership demonstrated by first and second line managers in policing is, because they are actually the people who set the culture. But unless and until we make it clear to those leaders what we expect from them, and then just as importantly provide them with the skills, the training, the education and the tools to enable them to live up to the organisation's determination to become genuinely anti-racist, that makes it more difficult to hold them to account. Once that training, that education, that upskilling has been delivered, we can then really start to impact on the culture of the organisation.
Mrs. Taylor, could I remind you that the proceedings are being transcribed by a stenographer remotely. Could I ask you just to take things a little more slowly in your answer?
Apologies, Chair. It's something I do tend to get quite
I appreciate that.
Passionate
Thank you.
about.
Mrs.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, if I can take that answer and sum up what I particularly want to ask you about, microaggressions could include matters pertaining to racial discrimination. And but it would not just be interpersonal, could also potentially be institutional matters. Now, we heard yesterday from you that Police Scotland seeks to have a zero tolerance attitude to any discrimination, and particularly we're interested in racial discrimination. Would a microaggression understood by a person, a colleague, an officer, as racial discrimination be dealt with through the 2014 regulations?
So again, Council, that I can't give you a binary answer to that, because what we have to accept and acknowledge is that there is an organisational responsibility to ensure that our colleagues understand that the behaviours that they are evincing could potentially be seen to be racist and discriminatory. But if an individual has come through the schooling system in Scotland, the schooling system anywhere else in the rest of the United Kingdom, for example, gone through university potentially, and then come into policing, they may not have any understanding that that behaviour is potentially racist. And it's our responsibility to educate those officers, to educate those first and second line managers, to help them to understand that those behaviours are not acceptable. Now, if there is then a recurring pattern of behaviour, then that is when my anticipation would be that yes, this does start to get into the conduct space. And equally, counsel, my anticipation would be that if those behaviours were evidenced towards a police constable by a more senior colleague, by a sergeant or an inspector, then again, tolerance levels from my perspective would come down.
So is it possible that an assessment could be carried out under the 2014 regulations under Regulation 10? That a decision is taken that this is perhaps at the lower level? You talked yesterday about honest mistakes or lack of awareness or the need for education. And then that will be diverted away from the regulations and dealt with through educational means.
That is very possible, yes. Right. Yeah, that is very possible. But again, just to follow on to your question, you know, if those were the circumstances which occurred, then clearly there would be records kept of that. And if we find somebody who, you know, is recidivist, for want of a better term, then again, you know, that where professional standards need to be is to look at that behaviour in the round over time.
So if someone is incapable or unwilling to be educated and to learn and to have regard to that increased awareness.
So I take you back to the statement that was made by Syrian, which said that, you know, if you hold values which are incompatible with the values of Police Scotland in terms of fairness, integrity, respect, a commitment to upholding human rights, and you evidence racist behaviour, then you are not welcome in Police Scotland.
And part of ensuring not only that those officers feel not welcome, but ensuring that they do not continue with Police Scotland would be, the 2014 regulations would be one of the mechanisms.
It would be one of the mechanisms, absolutely. However, you'll no doubt have recognised from the statement, if I have expressed myself properly within it, that actually the Policing Together programme, which we embarked upon in Police Scotland, was a long-term and from my perspective has to be sustained programme of cultural change within the organisation, which actually minimises the opportunity for anybody who has gone through the probationary training regime in Scotland moving forward, or indeed has partaken in any other training within Scotland, to continue to claim that they're, you know, oblivious to the fact that they are causing offence and that that might be racist offence.
Thank you. Can I move on and ask you questions about a statement we have, Deborah Coles, SBPI 00607. And I'm interested in paragraph 100. Now, this is an inquiry statement that's been provided to the chair and it's been signed by Ms. Coles, and we're hoping at some stage to hear further evidence from her, although we haven't yet. So if we look at paragraph 100, it says, I'm asked whether the approach I described of deaths being investigated with a starting assumption that there is no potential criminality and wrongdoing is a common theme among cases I've seen. Absolutely. It's almost like they have a narrative in their minds and they're working towards justifying that narrative and explaining that narrative rather than approaching it independently and with a very open mind. It's also the way in which we see time and again state denial, defensiveness and a lack of candour from public authorities and police officers, more concerned with reputation management than a properly conducted, full and fearless investigation and the pursuit of the truth. There isn't that political concern in the way that I think that there should be, because at the end of the day, somebody's died at the hands of the state. Now, we will hear that Deborah Coles is a director of inquest, and we'll hear more from her. But I understand you're aware of who Deborah Coles is.
Yes.
Now, looking at that, and we can bring that back up, the top of that paragraph, I'd like to ask you for your comments on this. She describes this as a starting assumption that there's no potential criminality and wrongdoing. And that's a common theme that she's seen in cases, and a narrative that they're justifying and explaining that rather than approaching things with an open mind. And I wonder if you can express to us whether you agree with that comment or whether that's a surprise to you.
So I'm very aware of the work that Ms Coles does. I'm aware of Inquest. I'm aware of the incredible work that they're doing, particularly in England and Wales, predominantly in England and Wales. If that is Deborah's perception, then that's absolutely the circumstances that Deborah Coles has experienced. From my perspective, and I think we did touch on this yesterday, the investigation of any death in custody, the death of an individual at the hands of the state, absolutely should be approached with an open mind, with due regard to any and all circumstance that may be relevant to the death of that individual, and should be investigated independently, rigorously, and certainly without ruling anything out at the start of the investigation.
And if we move down the page, we'll go back to the passage where she says, time and again she sees denial, defensiveness, and a lack of candour from public authorities and police officers more concerned with reputation management than a properly conducted full and fearless investigation. Do you have any comments to make about that?
So again, what I would say, and forgive me, Council, but I will contextualise this into a Police Scotland sort of context, as opposed to perhaps the context that Ms Coles is more familiar with. I would argue that our previous Chief Constable's declaration that our organisation is institutionally discriminatory is absolutely not about defensiveness. It's not about a lack of candour or transparency. It's about an absolute commitment from a Police Scotland perspective moving forward to get things right for every member of every community in our country.
Has there been a change between 2018 and the statement made by Surrey and Livingston last year?
There is the Police Scotland is in an ongoing sort of developmental phase. Culture change, as you know, Council, is not quick. In an organisation of 23,000 people, which is as diverse as Police Scotland is, as you know, anybody can become a police officer, and that is the strength of the organisation in many ways, but it also means that we do have to create this kind of understanding of how we expect our colleagues to behave towards one another, but also towards members of the public for whom we are it's our responsibility to provide them with a service. So yes, I think the organisation is developing. If I look back on my career in Police Scotland, the one thing that I really regret not doing was having those conversations with my colleagues from black and minority ethnic sort of officers within Scotland through the auspices of Semper Scotland in 2018 rather than 2019. If I could have done, if I look back, say, could I have done anything? Well, one of the many things that I could have done differently or done better would have been to have, really understood the experiences and the environment that those colleagues were struggling with and trying to deliver a service within. And perhaps I should have been more effective earlier in my tenure at starting to pull the Policing Together programme together.
Do you recognise that the description that's given by Deborah Coles, that at least at one time there was denial, defensiveness, and a lack of candour, and more concern with reputation management?
So I wouldn't want to speak about the events of 2015 in that context because I wasn't here. It's not fair for me to do that. I can reflect on experiences in England and Wales and the Metropolitan Police, for example, and yeah, some of those behaviours were evident. Yeah, and that was because I was there at the time and witnessed them.
Thank you. Could we look at paragraph 153? Shamefully as well, families rarely are informed as to what changes have actually happened as a result of an investigation. It's a complete disservice and insult to bereaved families. What families tell us time and again is that nothing can bring their loved ones back, but they want systemic and meaningful change so that nobody else goes through a similar experience. We've seen a lack of candour and that culture of defensiveness from state bodies towards change and learning during investigations, more concerned about reputation management and protecting their policies and practices than learning and improvement. Often you will find that state lawyers will argue against recommendations being made, or they'll dismiss the need for recommendations because of the passage of time, rather than seeing the scrutiny afforded by an in-depth look at how and why somebody dies as an opportunity to avoid another death taking place. And I think from what you've said earlier today and yesterday, is it fair to say that the Policing Together programme is designed to facilitate that change over a long-term period?
Yes, Council.
And we'll come on to that again later. Can I move back to something else that you mentioned yesterday, and that was the gold group? And you said it wasn't a critical incident gold group, it was a different type of gold group, and it existed for a number of years.
Yes.
But it was related to Mr. Bio's death. And yesterday we looked at paragraph 8 of your inquiry statement. We'll just have that on the screen so that you can refresh your memory on that. You have a hard copy.
I do.
So we touched on this yesterday, and you said that had been formed prior to your appointment with Police Scotland, and it was concerned with issues including community engagement, the overview of ongoing legal matters, the overview of any internal investigations and processes, situational awareness of ongoing media coverage, and the welfare of the officers involved. We've heard evidence about the gold group as it was originally and the terms of reference of that gold group, and I wonder if I could refer you to those for a moment. If we could look at PS 06491. And this will be the gold group meeting minutes from the 3rd of May 2015. So that was the day that Mr. Bio died. And at 11:30 in the morning at Kirkcaldy Police Station, you'll see that a number of officers were present. ACC Nicholson was the gold commander, and then there were others. You may recognise those names. If we could look at item 1, the terms of reference, you'll see at the final in black print in italics, it says, ensure the integrity, interest and reputation of the Police Service of Scotland and its staff is maintained and safeguarded. And you'll see in these minutes underneath in red, it says, agreed that the wording of the terms of reference would be considered and amended for future meetings to provide terminology specific to circumstances of incident. But I asked a number of witnesses about the inclusion within the terms of reference, about the integrity, interest and reputation of Police Scotland being included as one of the terms of reference of that gold group at that time. And we've taken evidence from a number of witnesses regarding that. And can I ask you, looking at the gold group that you chaired, perhaps we should look at the minutes of that. PS 05673, and this is from January 2020, 24th of January. And you'll see this is the Police Scotland Sheffield Bio Gold Group, 18th September 2018. Chair was DCC Fiona Taylor. Move down, and if we look at the proposed terms of reference, which are, keep going, there we are. There's a reference to ensuring the police service provides an effective and professional response to all aspects of this inquiry and to any associated events, engage with and support PERC, provide reassurance to the community, maintain appropriate levels of support to staff, develop and implement a strategic internal and external communication strategy, and identify priorities for improvement to ensure any organisational learning. Now, I appreciate that the wording is different here, but was there any lingering sense that really what was being maintained here was the reputation of Police Scotland?
So from my perspective, the reputation of Police Scotland stands on the effectiveness of the investigation, our candour, our openness, our transparency. And I think those terms of reference reflect that actually public confidence in policing in Scotland is not going to be maintained if we come across as a defensive, closed organisation which lacks transparency. So this is very much about, it's important, of course it's important, a young black man has died in the hands of, at the hands of, or in the course of contact with police officers. So it's absolutely fundamental that we maintain the confidence of every community in Scotland about the service that they will receive from the police service of Scotland. So I think it's really important that the maintenance of public confidence in policing in Scotland, remains uppermost in the minds of those who attend such goal groups. But the important thing is that public confidence will be. This isn't about the status of the organisation or the organisation trying to be defensive. It's a genuine understanding that public confidence can only be maintained if we are open and we are transparent. And as the Chief Constable has said on a number of occasions, if we make mistakes, we acknowledge those mistakes and we learn from them and we move forward.
Can I go back to the top of the minutes, please? And you'll see that the attendance is given at the beginning, as is the norm with minutes. And if we move down, oh, sorry, I've gone too far. Can we see there that David Kennedy is dialing in, and he's from the SPF. We've heard evidence across the inquiry that by some witnesses, not all, who have expressed concerns about a narrative in the media, which some witnesses have suggested was at the instigation of SPF. We've heard that SPF is a membership organisation, and there's been concerns about advice given to members, officers at the outset. So some concerns have been voiced, and I wondered why the decision was taken to include SPF in the attendees of this Gold Group meeting.
So this was a Gold Group which I think, if I recall from the date at the top of those minutes, Council, took place relatively soon after I joined Police Scotland, so I'm, if you like, inheriting a legacy Gold Group at this stage. The SPF clearly, and we've said that one of our responsibilities is that ongoing duty of care to the officers who were involved in the incident on the 3rd of May, and that's the SPF's locus, Council, in terms of helping us to understand how we support our officers, subject officers in this case. The membership of the Gold Group did develop and change over time. I'm sure we can provide you with updates to how those Gold Groups evolved if you don't have them, and certainly. Now again, I'm going slightly on memory here. I would need to see the minutes to refresh my memory, but certainly in the last couple of years, I don't think there was any membership, and that's not casting any aspersions on the SPF at all, but the Gold Group evolved, and I don't think the SPF continued its membership of that Gold Group. But I can understand why they would have a locus, and that, as I say, is because of their responsibility to ensure that the organisation lives up to its obligations to their members, to subject officers.
So if the locus or the interest of the SPF is welfare of officers, why did there come a point where the SPF stepped away from the Gold Group?
Because I asked that a chief officer, an ACC, take responsibility for the welfare of those officers. That was the realignment of responsibility that came about as the Gold Group developed. My understanding of the events of the 3rd of May 2015 developed. So we had an ACC along with the divisional commander, ACC Tim Mayers, who was responsible for welfare and well-being, and had a subordinate group to look at the issues around welfare and well-being, which answered provided updates into the Gold Group, which I chaired.
And in your view, is that more appropriate that Police Scotland have regard to welfare of their officers?
Absolutely. I think there is a duty of care on the part of Police Scotland. It shouldn't just be about the SPF.
And was there any concerns about SPF being included, having taken that role up till then, or was there a reason why you changed?
Gold groups evolve over time, and clearly there was significant evolution when we understood that we were likely to be supporting or be a core participant in a public inquiry. And the Gold Group evolved to ensure that Police Scotland could properly discharge our responsibilities towards the public inquiry. That's one example that I would give you. I can't speak to why the SPF had been on the Gold Group previously. I do know the individual concerned, who I think is absolutely he is an ethical individual and has would have the best interests of the officers at heart. I don't think there would be any desire or determination on the part of that particular individual to do anything other than provide that support to the officers.
Can I ask you again about the Oversight Board? We touched on this yesterday afternoon, and that was set up in 2021.
Yes.
And you talked about Dame Eilish's 2020 report at that time, and that being one of the elements that fed into the decision to set up the Oversight Board. Can I ask you, having received the report from Dame Eilish, as she then was, regarding the 2020 report, what steps were taken by you in relation to implementing any of her recommendations?
So we took those recommendations incredibly seriously. Not least because the experiences that colleagues related to Dame Eilish were absolutely the experiences that those colleagues had related to myself through the auspices of Semper, and the prospect of losing black and minority ethnic colleagues between 3 and 5 years of service, it was just inimical. Quite honestly, Council. So the recommendations that Dame Eilish made in the round were incredibly important. So we set up within Police Scotland a team to look at the recommendations for Police Scotland fell generally into 2 categories. One category was in the P&D, the people space, and another category was in were those which pertain to professional standards and the way that the PSD as an entity went about its business. So we took all of those recommendations incredibly seriously. Each recommendation was given an action owner. There were organisational structures pulled together within Police Scotland, and as you'll be aware, Council, I suspect, multi-agency sort of working groups to look at the discharge of Dame Eilish's recommendations, along with a ministerial group which exercised very strategic oversight of the recommendations, and upon which I sat deputising for the Chief Constable. So there was a multi-layered approach at a very high level within our organisation and indeed Scotland to ensure that Dame Eilish's recommendations were given effect to and were discharged. Again, within Police Scotland Council, the recommendations that sat within the gift of Police Scotland to discharge without the need for external legislation, and we talked yesterday about the bill that is wending its way through Parliament, before we discharge those recommendations, each of those recommendations with the associated action sitting alongside them were provided to HMICS so that then now His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary could actually quality assure the work which we had done to discharge the recommendations which Dame Eilish made for Police Scotland.
So by the time you retired, without looking at any recommendations that required legislation, had steps been put in place to implement those recommendations?
Yes. Yeah, and there is a very detailed action plan action tracker, I should say, which outlines exactly the work which has been done to discharge those recommendations. Now, we have that internally, and I'm sure we can furnish you with it, but that also sits on the Scottish Government's website, because the Scottish Government reported, I think it was quarterly or 6 monthly, on progress towards discharging the recommendations from Dame Eilish's review. There are, I think, certainly when I retired, 3 recommendations for PSD which had not been discharged, and that was because those recommendations required an IT upgrade to the Centurion professional, so that's the computer system, the IT system that sits within professional standards that basically collates all of the material which goes into professional standards. It was not, it's an old system, it's an elderly system. It didn't, to the best of my knowledge, have the ability to differentiate as effectively as we could around the ethnicity of those who were making complaints into professional standards. So the professional standards team are in the process at the moment of upgrading the Centurion ICT, the computer system that manages all of their record keeping.
Did you have a time scale for that being upgraded?
It's really complex, and I'm not an ICT specialist at all. Can get you the detail on that one, but because it's a national system, and I think, I might be wrong here, but I think Police Scotland had potentially missed a couple of upgrades, so there needed to be preliminary upgrades for the Centurion system before we could bring it bang up to date. I think that is still ongoing. I couldn't speak to what the timescale is.
Thank you. Could we go back to Deborah Cole's statement, please? SBPI 00607. 152. Paragraph 152. Here we are. Inquests have identified a real accountability gap. It is difficult to find out what has happened to the countless recommendations that have come out of investigations. Official responses to recommendations often lack detail and are a cut and paste or formulaic response to some of these reports. There's a complete lack of transparency on the extent to which public bodies are actually implementing recommendations. Quite often recommendations are not analysed. There's no central location where the public can view the progress of any of these recommendations. So I'm interested in 2 aspects of this. First of all, whether the public can view progress of the recommendations within the progress you're making, Police Scotland, and whether there is, to some extent, a lack of detail or a formulaic response to some of the recommendations. Can we deal with the public's ability to access this information first?
Certainly. Well, we've talked about Dame Eilish and the recommendations from Dame Eilish's review, which are posted on the Scottish Government's website, and there is absolute transparency around those. We report to the Scottish Police Authority. The Scottish Police Authority has a bespoke scrutiny group which oversees the Policing Together programme and reports back to the public SPA board on the progress which is being made by Policing Together against the action plan that sits. So there's the EDI strategy has 4 outcomes. Those 4 outcomes have a number of actions which sit behind them. There is no point in having a strategy if you don't have an action plan. We have an action plan which sits behind the strategy, and the Scottish Police Authority take a very close interest in our progress to discharge the actions from the EDI strategy, and that is reported upon publicly through the Scottish Police Authority main board.
So in terms of public access, that could either be through the Scottish Government website or through SPA?
Yes.
Okay. And then the other point that I was interested in was the criticism by Deborah Coles that responses often lack detail. They're cut and paste or formulaic responses to some of these reports and the recommendations contained within them. Can I ask for your comment about that? To what extent are the responses to these recommendations, primarily the 2020 recommendations by Lady Eilish, to what extent are there detailed responses and not cut and paste, formulaic or lacking in detail?
So a couple of issues there, Council. In the first instance, I would not have tolerated cut and paste or, if you like, rehashed responses to the recommendations. We will provide, I'm quite sure through Council, we can provide that action tracker to you, and you will see that each of the recommendations has a bespoke response beside it. Now, if I take, for example, Dame Eilish spoke about the culture within PSD. We have introduced a new, very, very detailed, I think it's a 5-day training programme for officers who are coming into our professional standards department. We have introduced implicit bias training for officers who work within professional standards. That's just one example. We are looking at the grievance process, because the grievance process has been identified by us and was identified by Dame Eilish as a point of potential failure. It didn't satisfy anybody, timelines, outcomes, and the like. So colleagues in people in development have basically gone back to first principles with our grievance process to ensure that actually it works for everybody who has reason to use it. So I would argue that the recommendations, our response to those recommendations, and again, remember that second layer of, if you like, assessment of the quality of those recommendations was by an independent body, was by Her Majesty, now His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary in Scotland, before they got to Scottish Government. I would argue that we took those recommendations incredibly seriously. I had an overview of them in my time in Police Scotland, and I think the responses to them are bespoke, they are tailored, and they are dovetailed with that broader policing together cultural change programme.
Thank you. Could we look at paragraph 161? And this is, again, Deborah Cole's statement. To then see that those recommendations have still not been enacted is really frustrating and actually makes me really angry. What is the point of all these processes if the state can just dismiss them and not be held accountable for that? My view is that in reality that report is sitting on a shelf somewhere. Every now and again the dust is removed and somebody has a little look because they've been asked a difficult question about what's happened to some of the recommendations. From your previous answer, I can guess that's not how you would describe the Police Scotland response to the 2020 report by Dame Eilish.
Council, that's absolutely correct, and it is Dame Eilish, but it's also broader. Our approach to cultural change is broader than the very helpful recommendations that we received from Dame Eilish. And this, policing together isn't sitting on a shelf. Policing together is a living entity, or something it was when I retired, is a living entity within the body of Police Scotland, which aims to drive cultural change within an incredibly important public body for the better and for good.
Can I ask if we can go back to your statement, please, to paragraph 13. So we'll move away from the statement by Deborah Coles. Discipline and professional standards have always had a place within the police service. Within PSD, there was a real focus on organisational learning and feeding good practice back into divisions and the wider organisation. In terms of any PSD investigation, there was an absolute commitment to a transparent, independent and highly competent investigation. PSD was restructured to ensure this was the case. Now, a PSD investigation, does that relate to when a complaint about conduct, for example, has been received? Or is that something else that's being described there?
No, that could very well reflect, or that could very well relate to a complaint about conduct. It could also relate to a complaint from a member of the public, rather than internal conduct of one police officer saying, "I don't think this colleague is treating me appropriately." From the conduct perspective, also relates to complaints against the police service or against individuals within the police service from the public. And that restructuring in terms of complaints from the public was to ensure that the frontline resolution piece, if it was a relatively minor complaint and could be resolved by means of an explanation or an apology, was done by colleagues was carried out by colleagues from professional standards, as opposed to a member of the local team in the area that the complaint may have arisen.
And in terms of a PSD investigation, was there one after the death of Mr. Bio?
So again, that goes back to going back to 2015, Council. I think that takes us back into the realms of the conversation that we had yesterday. That the investigation, an Article 2 investigation, was carried out by the PERC. I don't know whether there was any professional standards sort of involvement back in 2015. I apologise for that.
And after we talked briefly yesterday about correspondence that was sent by the legal representatives of the Bio family direct to the Chief Constable, yes, Mr. Sir Ian. And after that formal complaint was sent in, that was at a time in 2019, after Lord Wilman's opinion, when you were the DCC. Was there any PSD investigation at that time?
Council, I genuinely I'm not avoiding the question, I genuinely can't remember. There are no circumstances under which a letter of that nature would have come into the Chief Constable and not been actioned. But exactly what action was taken and what stage it reached, I would need to ask colleagues to refresh my memory, or ask for you to ask the Chief himself around
we hope to hear from Sir Ian Livingston,
yes,
and we could perhaps explore that with him. Can I ask you about the independent review group?
Yes.
You make reference to this group in paragraph 18 of your statement. And you'll see towards the bottom, that final paragraph there, it's just at the bottom of the screen. In addition, there should be independent external evaluation and oversight, such as that provided by the Independent Review Group, IRG, set up following the Dame Ailish review, and the SPA to ensure that the outcomes described in the EDI strategy and associated documents and implementation plan are delivered and their effectiveness assessed. Now, we've heard about the Gold Group, we've heard about the Oversight Board, and now this paragraph refers to the Independent Review Group, or the IRG. We've also heard mention of the Professional Reference Group, the PRG, and I wonder if you could help us understand who the IRG and the PRG are.
Of course. So one of Dame Ailish, if we start with the IRG Council.
That would be helpful, thank you.
One of Dame Ailish's recommendations, she said she was so sort of shocked by the situation within Police Scotland in terms of our care or lack of care for minority ethnic colleagues, that there should be a root and branch review of equality, diversity and inclusion within Police Scotland. That's one of Dame Ailish's recommendations. We thought long and hard about how we could accomplish or how we could discharge that recommendation, and we considered a number of options, Council. We considered an academic evaluation of equality, diversity and inclusion within Police Scotland, but we actually discounted that because what I wanted, agreed with the Chief Constable and indeed with the then Cabinet Secretary for Justice, Mr Youssef, was that it would be far better to ask a group of individuals not connected with Police Scotland, but who were exemplars and either advocates or with lived experience or academics in the field of equality, diversity and inclusion, to come together as a group, to be invited into Police Scotland, to be given access to, use that cliche, access all areas within Police Scotland, and to get into our organisation and to help us understand where we could and should do better. But equally, I was really optimistic that by bringing together a group, a highly powered group of individuals who really understand how you change the culture of an organisation, they could also point Police Scotland in the direction of exemplars. Whereas an organisation which really understands its culture, understands how to change its culture, how can you help us align with an organisation such as that so that we can accelerate and enhance our own learning? So that was the IRG Council, a group of experts, academics, lived experience, community advocates across all protected characteristics, not just in the area of race, because we thought it was important that we become properly anti-discriminatory. Those individuals were kind enough and generous enough to come together to set an IRG up. It was independently chaired. I suggested working together with colleagues, and indeed the SPA, the chair of the SPA, suggested an initial membership for that group, but made it very clear to that group that you are independent. Please do go out and bring any expertise into that group that you think will enhance its ability to deliver on its terms of reference. That group has delivered at least one. I'm not sure. I think it was due to deliver a second recommendation to the Scottish Police Authority. A second report containing recommendations to the Scottish Police Authority. That's post my retirement, so I'm not sure whether that second report has been delivered. The first report, coincidentally, was delivered to the Scottish Police Authority in May 2023, on the same day that Sir Ian spoke about the organisation in relation to institutional discrimination between Scotland. So that's the IRG, an independent group, set apart from Police Scotland, but that can come in, go anywhere it wants in the organisation, request any documentation, and then basically give us recommendations on how we improve. That's the IRG.
And who are the PRG? So
the professional reference group is different. I need to be very careful here because Council, Police Scotland Council, attend the professional reference group, so I don't want to trample into the area of privilege. However, the concept for me with the professional reference group was something that I'd seen in the Met. When I was in the Met, the public inquiry into undercover policing was just being set up. The Metropolitan Police Service brought a number of experts in issues such as sort of communications, surveillance, all of those kind of issues that were pertinent to the undercover policing investigation into the organisation to support them with their thinking and their understanding and their development towards supporting the UCPI. When I came into Police Scotland, when the public inquiry was announced, quite frankly, I looked around at my colleagues and thought, well, I'm a police officer, 28-year service at that point in time, but I'm a white middle-class female. How can I possibly understand what it feels like to be, a black citizen in Scotland in 2019 or 2020? So the PRG, again, not a dissimilar sort of concept to the IRG. It was about bringing advocates, academics, and the reason I'm stuttering slightly is one absolutely, any number of outstanding academics into the PRG, but also people from minority ethnic backgrounds, so that they could talk to us about what it feels like to be black or to be Asian in Scotland in 2019, and so Council, they could really, this was about really challenging our thinking. This group of individuals have access to myself, had access to the Chief Constable. They had access to our council team, and my goodness, they told us what they thought about Police Scotland in terms of its ability to discharge its obligations, both to people within our organisation, but also to broader communities within Scotland. So it was a smaller group, it was more focused on the public inquiry, and again brought lived experience, but a wealth of academic understanding of the concepts of racism, anti-racism, institutional discrimination and the like, that we have used to help understand how we should respond to the issues which have arisen across the public inquiry.
Who is on the PRG?
So again, I might just, I will, if you don't mind, just check with Council on that. If we do have a list of members, obviously, but that may have changed. I can see Council nodding at me. So I can provide you, or we can provide you with that membership list, Council. I'm just very conscious. I don't know whether the individuals who are on the PRG, since I've been away from Police Scotland, have any anticipation that they may be named in a public forum. So there may be another way of providing you with that information.
That would be very helpful, but we will. I'm sure the team can liaise with Council in regard to identify who's on it. Thank you. We can do that another time. Do the PRG prepare reports or recommendations which can then be implemented by Police Scotland?
They certainly prepare reports, yes, to assist and challenge our thinking.
And what happens to those reports?
They are integrated into, I'm certainly thinking, take one report in particular around, what it means to be a genuinely anti-racist organisation. That was integrated into Council's sort of opening statement, and also integrated into the thinking of the Chief Constable when he talked about his understanding of institutional discrimination and what it actually means.
And how does that then get, I think we've heard the word cascaded used by other witnesses. How is that information cascaded to officers who are constables and in response teams and doing their daily business?
Multiple channels. Multiple channels. So the Policing Together programme has its own dedicated website. We decided from a very early stage that that website should be a portal into equality, diversity and inclusion within Police Scotland. So within that portal are, for argument's sake, the Chief Constable's statement to the Scottish Police Authority in May 2023. There is additional material within that portal about, well, what does institutional discrimination actually mean? What is it? What isn't it? How do you explain that to your team? How do you make it very clear to your team that what the Chief Constable is saying is not that you are a racist? It's actually that the systems, structures and processes within Police Scotland might be amenable to being unwittingly racist. And we need to accept that before we can be properly anti-racist. So all of that material sits within the Policing Together portal. Council. It's also amplified by through the education and training programmes that we were taking forward in Police Scotland prior to my retirement. You'll see mentioned in the statement Your Leadership Matters, which is it's basically a kind of watershed moment, I think, for Police Scotland. That is training and education for every single line manager in Police Scotland, or certainly it was when I retired. Education and training for every single line manager in Police Scotland. The golden thread of which is how to lead inclusively. It's about how to lead courageously, how to lead collaboratively, but also how to lead inclusively. So again, that is a method for cascading to first and second line managers, and indeed every line manager in Police Scotland, up to including the Force Executive, what it means to be anti-discriminatory and what the standards of behaviour are that are expected from them. So there's that training and education programme ongoing. There's also, and again I think we have referenced it, there was also an online package around EDI and how you become, how you basically fulfil your obligations towards your colleagues and towards members of the public from an EDI perspective. So there was that online training for every member of Police Scotland. My ambition before I retired was that that online package would simply get the organisation to a common base point, an understanding of equalities legislation, of the aspiration of Police Scotland, the requirements on individuals within Police Scotland. That would then be followed up by face-to-face, high-quality EDI training for every single person within Police Scotland. Along with that, there were local divisional initiatives ongoing, where again, all of the issues that we've discussed this morning were discussed with local divisional command teams, and indeed with a broader cross-section of divisional colleagues as well. So, as I say, statements from the Chief, statements from the Chair of the IRG, if you like, resource sitting within the Policing Together portal, and ongoing training, development and education for every single person in Police Scotland, which integrates all of the learning that the organisation has accrued.
Thank you. Can I ask you some questions about statistics? If we look at paragraph 5 of your statement, on joining Police Scotland, one of the first actions I gave ACC Spears, who was ACC Professionalism and Assurance, was to review conduct statistics to identify whether there was disproportionality so far as officers from black and minority ethnic backgrounds were concerned. I was reassured to find there were not. However, I am aware that individual officers from a minority background could and did feel that their treatment by and relationship with professional standards was not always as informed and empathetic as it might have been. This is why we introduced enhanced implicit bias training into PSD around 2020. I'd like to ask you about the review you requested from ACC Spears regarding conduct statistics to identify whether there was disproportionality so far as officers from black and minority ethnic backgrounds were concerned. We've heard some evidence about statistics, and there seems to be, if I can put it this way, some uncertainty, some confusion about what is available, what is provided. Could you help us with that?
That was very much the point I made about the Centurion database not being as effective as it should be, or not being as up to date as it could and should be in terms of helping us to understand the ethnicity, categorisation and protected characteristics of those who have made a complaint or are subject to a complaint. So it was very much a kind of manual assessment that ACC Spears did at the time. There are sadly not that many black and minority ethnic officers in Police Scotland. So in terms of understanding pro rata whether black and minority ethnic colleagues were overrepresented in the discipline process, it was at that point in time it was much more of a piece of manual work the ACC Spears team carried out for me.
And if it was a piece of manual work, was it subject to an individual's discretion or assessment of the paperwork?
It would be subject to that, yes. But I took a share, and again, this is, you know, if we want to go into this more deeply, then I'm sure we can. But I took confidence from the fact that ACC Spears assured me that he had researched the circumstances of, and this is colleagues in the discipline process, and that there was not disproportionality as is seen in some other police services within Police Scotland. And certainly my experience now, again, officers who make complaints from minority ethnic groups, and that's the point about not necessarily, they do not necessarily always feel that Police Scotland has been as empathetic towards them as they could and should have been, and that's what we're looking at, upskilling our colleagues in PSD to try to avoid happening in future. But in terms of officers within the conduct process in their own right, being investigated back in 2018, I was assured by the ACC as a consequence of the work that he'd done that there was not disproportionality.
So limitations with Centurion itself, yes. It was a manual review. I
think so. That's again, we're going back to 2018. I can think it can only have been a kind of manual review simply because we could not trust Force Systems to provide us with the detail.
Right. There were a limited number of data sets or data information. And there were issues with the data collected. I think, is it fair to say that that sums it up?
So I think the data collected would have been valid. It's about how that data was then, if you like, understood and processed, and how effective our systems were, and I suspect still are actually enabling us to draw out trends and themes and understand the kind of macro elements of that data.
Thank you. Can I ask you about some other evidence that we have available from Sandra DeLond-Clark, who I understand you know?
Yes.
Now, my understanding is she's the chair of SEMPER.
Yes. And
we hope to hear evidence from Ms DeLond-Clark in due course in this hearing. Her statement is to SPPI 00626, and I'm interested in paragraph 25. And I'm going to, I'll read this out, and then I'm also interested in whether other aspect of evidence that is along the same lines, and I'll also read that before I ask you any questions. So 25, do black and minority ethnic officers and staff face being over-disciplined when the subject of a complaint compared to a white colleague in an equivalent position? And has that changed over time, and if so, how? And her response was, there is a widespread belief that like BME officers and staff in England and Wales, BME employees in Scotland are over-disciplined. However, as the race ethnicity of the subjects of complaints is not recorded by PSD, We cannot validate or refute that claim. However, we do know that because of their visible ethnic difference, BME response officers do tend to be the subjects of more malicious complaints from members of the public. BME officers or staff also believe that their ethnic difference does attract more scrutiny from supervisors and colleagues. That could be due to stereotyping, unfamiliarity, or ignorance. It's been likened to the proverbial O living in an X world, where O is always under the spotlight and everything he or she does is over-analysed. This can often lead to them being reprimanded more frequently than their white colleagues. With more training and an increase in the recruitment of BME officers and staff, this perception has been changing. Now, just before I ask you about that, we've also heard evidence from a Mr. Paul Castledine, who's a former officer, and he worked in Fife prior to the creation of Police Scotland. In his statement to the inquiry, he said, historically, a statistic had been discussed that a minority ethnic police officer was 3 times more likely to be interviewed by their colleagues than a white officer in connection with professional standards. And he then went on to say at paragraph 13 of his statement that in his experience a white officer would get a slap on the wrist, whereas an ethnic minority officer, they would do it by the book. And so obviously there's the two aspects of evidence that we've heard. I'm interested in your thoughts about what's said. Primarily we've left on the screen what Ms DeLond Clark has said. The idea of being over-disciplined, or as Paul Castledine says, the white officer is dealt with as a quick slap on the wrist. But with the ethnic minority officer, it's by the book. By that, as I understood it, he meant through the regulations, by the book.
So I have a huge amount of time and respect for Sandra, who is an incredible advocate within Police Scotland as the chair of Semper Scotland. I think it's important to say that. I still stand by the work that ACC Spears did on my behalf in terms of the circumstances within Police Scotland. Sandra deals, and she deals incredibly well day in, day out with officers from black and minority ethnic backgrounds within Police Scotland, and I make, I have been, I hope, quite open about the fact that the experience that those officers had or have is still not, wasn't and is still not what it should be. There's a lot more that we need to do there. Your point about, or that kind of quite kind of common understanding of the fact that white officers are, if they're persistently late or whatever, are basically told to pull their socks up, get in on time, whatever. But an officer from a black or minority ethnic background who potentially has a white supervisor might go down a different route. That is again part of the rationale for the Policing Together programme for first and second line managers, to ensure that there is equity in terms of the treatment of every single police officer and member of police staff within Police Scotland, and how you are dealt with if a particular set of circumstances comes to light is not a question of your ethnicity. There is something about upskilling first and second line managers as well, Council, and giving them the confidence actually to have, and we actually, this isn't confined, certainly in my time wasn't confined to black and Asian colleagues, black and minority ethnic colleagues. Sometimes it was easier for first or second line managers just to put stuff on paper rather than to deal with it themselves, to keep minor matters within the employment space. That's what that's what the Your Leadership Matters programme is designed to do. It's part of its rationale. It's designed to give first and second line managers the confidence actually to manage. If the chief were here, the last chief were here, he would say there was a lot that was done really well in the early days of Police Scotland, but there was a lot perhaps which was not done in that first 10 years that could have been. And that high quality leadership development activity that we are engaging in now was one of the areas that we could and should have done better in the first 10 years of the organisation.
So in terms of what we've heard from Paul Castledine and what we may hear further from Ms DeLond Clark, would you accept that there is a difference, or there has been in the past at least, a difference in the treatment of white and black officers in relation to disciplinary matters?
So again, I think I would never try to argue against that. You know, we know, and I know because I have spoken to my colleagues, you know, through the auspices of Semper Scotland, listening to their experiences. There are so two elements to that. The first is the element of an officer who is subject to you know, an interaction with their line manager, but also there is then the behaviour of line managers towards particular officers, which also needs to be looked at properly and effectively. Back to our earlier point about initial assessment and the like, by professional standards, to understand that if actually there has been racially discriminatory behaviour or other discriminatory behaviour evidence towards the black or minority officer, that in itself is also dealt with, and that is also dealt with effectively. And I think it's fair to say that hasn't necessarily always been the case.
Are there records now kept about line managers and how they are dealing with disciplinary matters compared to, for a white officer compared to a black officer?
So again, my ask would be that because of the upgrades that are going on to Centurion, I'm not quite sure what stage those have reached. But in terms of that document set, that is probably a question better answered by somebody who is currently serving.
Right, thank you. We can maybe look into
Yes.
that. Thank you very much. We've heard evidence from Kate Frame, who was the Commissioner at the time of Mr. Bio's death. And I'd like to ask you for your comments about some evidence she has given us. In relation to, from around September 2015, there was an instruction given by the Crown Office to PERC to investigate certain matters to do with race. And that was a specific instruction given at that stage. And one of those was to look, or part of that investigation was to consider statistics and to look at complaints. And she said in evidence that as an initial step, the PERC examined national police complaint statistics in order to identify whether those indicated a pattern of racist behaviour by officers in Fife Division. And she said investigators focused on allegations recorded under the category discriminatory behaviour, and that's one of the complaint categories adopted nationally, or it was at that time, by the Scottish Police Force. Such behaviour was defined as an allegation that a member of a police force engaged in a course of action interpreted as discriminatory towards an individual or group on the basis of race. And she said she was talking about her investigation team undertaking that analysis. But it became clear that race was not going to be able to be extracted from the overall data. So the only inference that could be drawn from any analysis could be in relation to overall discrimination across all categories, rather than allowing PERC to investigate the category of race alone. And I wonder, does that remain the position, or is this something that you're not able to help us with?
So again, I think that goes back to the database. Mm-hmm. And again, I would, there are people who are much more competent than I am, counsel, to talk to that.
And that's in connection with the Centurion
Yes.
database. All right, thank you.
I mean, what I would say is, if PSD receive a complaint of racial discrimination from a member of the public, that an officer has been racially discriminatory towards them, then I would absolutely expect, regardless of how that's ultimately recorded, PSD absolutely should be investigating that, and they should be investigating that from the perspective of the complainant.
Thank you. We've heard evidence from Professor Meir, that was last week, and he highlighted concerns that he was asked to prepare a report for the inquiry, which he spoke to last week. He said there were concerns that there remained no central reporting of deaths in custody in Scotland, nor a standardised reporting format utilised by individual agencies and organisations. He also highlighted that Police Scotland responses under Freedom of Information legislation was often provided without elementary demographic data, specifically the protected characteristics of the deceased. And it was reported that Police Scotland have noted in responses to FOI requests that they were not required to collect or report ethnicity data. Now, I appreciate in relation to what the database can achieve, we can perhaps get information from others. But are you surprised to find that apparently FOI requests and responses, the responses say they were not required to collect or report ethnicity data?
I am surprised. It's difficult for me to give you an informed response to that, Council. I would have to basically go and familiarise myself with exactly which FOI responses, why that material, why that data wasn't being provided if it was available within the police service. It might be something to do with the intricacies of the FOI legislation. I genuinely don't know. But I don't understand if there's a legitimate rationale for us to provide data, why we wouldn't provide it. So I'm not really able to competently answer that question, I don't think.
All right. No, thank you. Moving on again to Policing Together, which I understood launched on the 30th of September 2022. Is that correct?
Yes, I think so.
And if we look at your statement, please, and I think you've already touched on this, I'd like to look at paragraphs 28 and 29. And I think this is where you provide the Chair with some detail in connection with the Policing Together strategy.
Yes.
And if we look at 29, you say you were the... And I think you've given the Chair a lot of detail about this.
This isn't a series of random initiatives. This is a significant programme of work that we need to embed within Police Scotland moving forward.
Thank you. And as I say, you've given a lot of detail, which is very helpful. And here we are, 29. I was the Chief Officer lead with strategic oversight. So essentially you were in charge of this this project.
Yes, programme.
Programme, sorry. You were involved in the creation of the strategy, the creation of the different elements of Policing Together, and you advocated for the creation of a bespoke ACC portfolio for Policing Together to give operational effect to the strategy and to the broader policing ambition while maintaining focus on delivery of the programme. And I continued with the strategic oversight until I became the interim Chief Constable,
yes,
which you've told us about yesterday. I am interested in the idea of a bespoke portfolio, and I wonder if you could help us understand that a little better.
Of course. Policing Together is a significant programme of work. Absolutely fundamental to effecting genuine and lasting culture change within Police Scotland. The strategy, which is hopefully accessible through my statement by means of a hyperlink, as I say, has 4 outcomes and a number of actions sitting within the strategy, all of which have outcomes which the organisation needs to achieve in order to give effect to the strategy. There are also various different elements of Policing Together that you will have seen within the statement, one being training, communication, the prevention strategy that's sort of alluded to as well, and leadership. So this is a big piece of work. This is fundamental to Police Scotland being able to achieve its ambition to become a properly anti-racist and anti-discriminatory organisation. And I was really anxious that we didn't have one person to take responsibility for delivery of that programme. So I spoke to the Chief about it, and we created an additional, at that point in time, an additional ACC's post whose primary responsibility was to drive progress of Policing Together through Scotland and out through into sort of partner agencies where appropriate as well. For example, we've spoken to Crown about what we were doing. So it was actually, this is going to sound slightly melodramatic, Council, but it was keeping me awake at night. not being confident that we could actually deliver on our aspiration and our ambition. And I actually needed that tactical lead to come into post to begin to deliver on the different but interrelated elements of policing together.
We have heard some evidence from Professor Meir about situations where there can be a lack of what he described as institutional memory. Now, we have a statement from Sir Ian where he said he appointed Assistant Chief Constable David Duncan as a dedicated lead for Policing Together to ensure that the importance of the changes we wish to make regarding equality, diversity and inclusion would be driven with visible and dedicated senior officer commitment. And so as I understood it, ACC David Duncan was in place prior to Sir Ian's retirement with a view to taking the lead on that role and moving it forward. Has he now left Police
Yes.
Scotland? Now, we've heard that there can be a lack of institutional memory when individuals move on from particular roles, or they retire or leave for whatever reason. And I'm interested if you are aware of what arrangements are in place to ensure that there is not that loss of institutional memory, and that the progress that has been made and directed by you will continue even though the individual has left the organisation.
Certainly. You remarked yesterday, Council, on the number of bodies, individuals and organisations which participated in the Policing Together Senior Oversight Board. I came under some criticism for just how sort of bureaucratic that process was, but I was firmly of the opinion that actually you need to get the structures in place, because structures will continue potentially past individuals. If you build up that momentum in an organisation, if you get an organisation into a routine, if it continues to do things, and actually structurally with Policing Together, that was part of the, if you like, that was part of my ambition. So Policing Together, so there were the structures through the EDI Oversight Board and the subordinate boards that we have that are noted in the statement. Policing Together, whilst at that point in time it was led by ACC Duncan, there were other people sitting within that portfolio as well, Council. So there is continuity in terms of the personnel that were sitting within the Policing Together portfolio. Other teams, individuals, directors, ACCs also have had a part to play and still have a part to play in delivering Policing Together, people in development being foremost amongst those. But I also understand, and I'm incredibly pleased, that the organisation has recently identified a new ACC to take over from ACC Duncan to lead Policing Together. So the organisation now has ACC Kat Payton, who is David Duncan's replacement and will lead Policing Together going forward.
And I see you're looking, she's here today.
She is here today.
And I think she was here yesterday.
She
as
was.
well. Right, thank you. I'd now like to move on to another topic, duty of candour. Can you give me a moment while I check what time it is? All right. Would now be an appropriate...
Yes, well, we'll stop for 20 minutes now. Please go on.
Thank you. Before I move on from policing together, can I ask you a couple of other things?
Of course.
How is the impact of policing together? I appreciate it's relatively new, but how is the impact of all this work being evaluated?
So the EDI strategy in its own right, as we mentioned, has an accompanying action plan. And each of that action plan, each of those actions has owners or have owners, and the relevant sort of ACC will be responsible for holding the owners of the various actions that come out of the EDI strategy to account for delivery. And that's everything, including, are we managing to recruit and retain more members of staff from minority ethnic communities? To what are the number of grievances that are coming into the organisation? Have we actually accomplished some of the other elements of the strategy council, such as a review of relevant processes to ensure that there's no unwitting bias in them? So the action plan sits behind the strategy. I think the action plan, implementation plan is really, really important. And as we mentioned earlier, the SBA has a bespoke oversight group set up to hold Police Scotland to account against the delivery of the various elements of the EDI strategy. If we look at some of the other elements of the Policing Together plan, for argument's sake, the Your Leadership Matters programme, that is rigorously, or certainly in my time in Police Scotland, after every delivery of an element of the Your Leadership Matters programme, that was rigorously evaluated with those who participated in the training and education programme to understand whether actually it was having the outcomes that we anticipated and hoped that it would. And if not, then how do we amend that programme to ensure that actually it is more effective? So again, there are a number of different avenues, if you like, for evaluation and understanding impact. But what I should say is the SBA are key to that, because they are the oversight body for Police Scotland. And again, as we mentioned earlier, they report. The Scottish Police Authority reports publicly, and Policing Together is one of the elements that they are particularly interested in.
And so for those officers who have responsibility for the individual actions on the action plan, is there a programme for them to report to updates and reviews?
So again, I can only talk to the processes that were in place when I retired from Police Scotland, and there was a strategic oversight board which was chaired by myself, and then there were a number of subordinate boards, if you like, which sat underneath the strategic board. So there was an initial input into the strategic, or sort of subgroups, if you like, and then that reported up into the strategic oversight board. Again, Council, what I would say, because this is, and this certainly was an absolutely fundamental programme of work to Police Scotland, I was then responsible for further updating the whole of the Force Executive, including the then Chief Constable, through the auspices of our Senior Leadership Board, with the progress that the EDI programme was making.
So the actions are the responsibility of officers who are allocated those actions. They then feed into different strategic boards that then feed into the strategic oversight board. We do have schematics, or we certainly did have schematics around how the governance of Policing Together was managed. Again, if it would be helpful just to understand how all of these boards link together, who is held to account where, how, by whom, and where the ultimate, if you like, where the ultimate sign-off comes, I'm sure we can provide, because it is a big programme. I appreciate that sounds helpful.
It's unwieldy. We'll get you
you
those schematics.
And as well as measuring that impact, how will that be evaluated in years to come? Is this in line with what you said earlier about the structures that are in place, and you hope that they will remain in place in the years to come?
Yeah, and I think, Yeah, my ambition is that Police Scotland is representative of all of the communities of Scotland. So that is one of the kind of key indicators of whether or not we have been successful. Are we an organisation which people from all across every community in Scotland aspires to be a part of? So, you know, one element of the activity within Policing Together is, you know, we are quite overt about wanting to be wanting to have representation within the organisation, which is represented through the census in society at large. So there are, again, there are a number of different ways of measuring our success. And of course, you know, if we take the issue about of black and minority ethnic officers and members of police staff, there is the initial issue around recruitment, but then of course there are the issues around retention and progression, and actually creating you know, very senior officers from a black or minority ethnic background. That's why this is, and this is just one aspect of Policing Together, that's why this is such a long-term plan. So there are a number of ways that we need to continue to hold ourselves to account moving forward.
So in the period between September 2022, when it was set up, and the period when you retired,
Yes.
had it made a difference?
So I think it did make a difference. This is, I mean, I don't want to mark my own homework, to use that cliche. We had brought a strategy in place. We didn't have an equality, diversity and inclusion strategy within Police Scotland. Bringing that strategy into existence, that strategy was one of the most widely commented upon. There's a word that I'm searching for that I'm not finding at the moment. The engagement that we had across the organisation and outside of the organisation to agree on that strategy was as wide as anything that I have ever seen in my policing career. I take that as a sign of success, that people were sufficiently interested, actually, to want to contribute to the work of to the work of bringing this EDI strategy together. I take that as a success. At the same time, running alongside the creation of the EDI strategy, I suspect you may be aware, Council, there was a lot of work going on around sex equality and tackling misogyny, which was also a part of the Policing Together programme. I mention that because that brought with it a staff survey, which encouraged members of Police Scotland to contribute to how the organisation feels for them on a day-to-day basis. So again, we have some metrics in, I think that might have been 2022 or 2023, again to hold ourselves to account moving forward. And again, in terms of the progress that's been made in my time in office, setting up Your Leadership Matters, that was the largest training programme I think that Police Scotland had ever embarked on, looking to train, to upskill 5,500 leaders. When I left the organisation at the beginning of 2024, we were starting to work through our cohort of sergeants and inspectors. So again, I see that as real progress. You know, we were offering that high quality training and education that we hadn't been doing previously. And similarly with the EDI module, that hadn't existed previously. And I also think that the learning that we've taken out of the public inquiry to date and how that has had an impact, we talked yesterday about organisational learning, how that has had an impact on processes and policies within policing. Again, I take that as a measure of the organisation's maturity in terms of wanting to change and develop.
And on a day-to-day level, with individual officers who may be black or ethnic minority, have you, or at the time you were in Police Scotland, had you received any feedback at all that it was actually making a difference on the ground?
So I was really fortunate in as much as black and minority ethnic colleagues would speak to me, and they would speak to me regularly, and I would make a point of speaking to them. It seemed a small thing, but one of the initiatives that we did bring into existence, and this again was with the assistance of SEMPAR, was to put black and minority colleagues into the training environment, because we hadn't necessarily had black or minority ethnic colleagues in the training environment. And the thing about if you can see it, you can be it. These are officers who are successful. They've got through their probation, and they're now coming back into that training environment to support all colleagues, but particularly those from a minority background. The feedback I got from that was, at least one officer said, I wouldn't still be with Police Scotland were it not for the fact that I had colleagues who I could speak to about issues which were, bespoke to myself, knowing that they would listen and be able to assist me.
Thank you. So from what you've said, was Policing Together, set up in 2022, the first time Police Scotland had this EDI strategy?
So no, there has always, certainly from my perspective, been EDI activity ongoing in Police Scotland, public sector equality duties, for example. And there was always work inside of Police Scotland to look at culture from an employee perspective, but also service delivery from an external perspective. The piece for me about Policing Together Council was to bring all of that together. You know, to actually create that critical mass through the auspices of Policing Together. And also, as we said earlier, to add that additionality by means of training, education, development, the upskilling of our first, second, third line managers. All of the review of processes, all of that was through the auspices of the EDI strategy, but there was certainly EDI activity ongoing in Police Scotland prior to 2018, 2019. For argument's sake, there was a positive action team in existence, well in advance of 2022.
Thank you. I'd like to move on now to a duty of candour. And I wonder if we could look at SBPI 00638. Now, this is a joint committee report on human rights and in relation to a proposal for something called Hillsborough Law. Now, this was published in May of this year, 24th of May this year. I appreciate you were retired at that stage. But I'm interested in any thoughts you would have on a duty of candour, which you did mention yesterday. And you talked about the bill that's currently going through the Scottish Parliament. Can we look at the conclusions and recommendations? And this is towards the very end of the document. It's paragraph 2 of the conclusions. So if you go right, the very final pages are actually a sort of appendix thing, but it's just prior to the very final sort of pages. It'll be above that, above the minutes. Keep going, you're on the conclusions now. That's it, conclusions and recommendations. And this summarises the entire report. The chair will have the report available to him, but you'll see here under a duty of candour, paragraph 2, institutional defensiveness appears to remain a problem for public authorities, particularly when they are involved in public inquiries and inquests. This hinders efforts to establish the truth when things go wrong and stands in the way of fulfilling the state's investigative obligations under Article 2 and Article 3 of ECHR. Introducing criminal sanctions for breach of a duty of candour may increase the prospect of the duty being taken seriously, offering greater external mechanisms to pursue public institutions that fail to comply. However, including criminal offences on the statute book is not alone sufficient to ensure compliance. Effective enforcement in practice, together with wider efforts to support culture change within the public sector, are also needed if the transparency and openness sought by the Hillsborough Law is to be established. So I'm interested in this concept of institutional defensiveness. Now, obviously, there's a specific mention of public inquiries, and you have been engaging with this inquiry. I'm interested if you recognise the concept of institutional defensiveness, which would hinder the efforts to establish the truth when things go wrong.
Within Police Scotland or more broadly? I mean, there's another public inquiry ongoing at the moment, as you'll be aware, Council, where institutional defensiveness is, a key element, and it's very, very obvious. I would argue.
I'm interested, obviously, in your perspective from Police Scotland.
I think Police Scotland in 2024, as an organisation, endeavours to be entirely transparent and candid. The Chief Constable, the previous Chief Constable, has said, time and time again that he expects the organisation to be transparent, and when it gets things wrong, to apologise for what it's got wrong, to make those wrongs right to the extent that we can, and then to move forward. So I don't deny that the issue issue of institutional defensiveness, is a very real issue. I would hope that with Police Scotland in 2024, it would be something which was largely, an issue which may have bedevilled the organisation retrospectively. There is no reason for us to be defensive. If we get things wrong, we need to acknowledge that we've got things wrong, because actually that's how an organisation learns. And certainly that's the approach that we've been taking through the public inquiry to learn from some of the issues that occurred on, and after the events of the 3rd of May 2015.
And when you say that things are different in 2024, is this part of a, for want of a better word, a sort of journey of improvement? Is there still issues about institutional defensiveness in Police Scotland?
I think it is a journey of improvement. I would never say we are where we, ultimately want to be. I think we've spoken. And some of the questions that I was asked in terms of the Rule 8 talked about organisational culture. We are a large organisation. There is not one culture within Police Scotland. There are many cultures within Police Scotland. So to say that they are all at the same place in terms of transparent, I'll come back to something else in a second, but to say that they are all in the same place in terms of transparency and a desire to be absolutely candid, I wouldn't. I couldn't necessarily say that that was the case for every aspect of the organisation. However, what I certainly can say in my time in Police Scotland up until early 2024 was that the Force Executive are absolutely committed to candour, and the work that we're doing to enhance the culture of the organisation should impact on every element of policing culture across Police Scotland in time.
So at the time you left Police Scotland, what were your hopes in relation to long-term changes in Police Scotland, specifically with regard to the duty of candour?
My long-term ambition, Council, is that we wouldn't actually need a duty of candour, that officers and the organisation are candid. Acknowledge that in terms of maintaining public trust and confidence against all communities, candour is an absolute necessity. And goodness, I absolutely understand where the Hillsborough inquiry is coming from, but actually I would hope that this would just be within the DNA of the organisation to be candid about the events that it deals with and how it deals with the aftermath of critical incidents and events.
And do you agree with the phrase there that effective enforcement in practice, together with wider supports to support culture change, is needed? Would you agree with that? So
we're going through that. Police Scotland is going through that culture change sort of programme at the moment. You asked what my long-term ambition would be. It would be that there was no need for any sanction, that the carrot in its own right should be enough. However, I've been I was a police officer for close to 31 years, so I understand the reality of policing, if not the reality of necessarily every other organisation. And culture change is long-term, and sometimes there is a need for a bit of stick as well as the carrot. But I would hope that those, if, as you say, sanctions within the law are not necessary because the organisation's culture is such that actually a duty of candour is just part of, our values and standards.
And in terms of wider supports and wider efforts, do you see that you've talked about your hopes for the culture of Police Scotland changing and continuing
Yes.
to change? There's mention here of possible criminal offences being attached to the duty of candour. Would you also see a role for the conduct regulations to ensure that officers are complying with those standards of professional behaviour?
So I think that's an absolutely valid point. The piece for me about the conduct regulations, as we discussed yesterday, is I don't think they are nearly transparent enough. I think the more that public understands about understands around every aspect of policing, then the more confident the public can become in how we are actually carrying out our business. So I would certainly like to see elements of the conduct regulations dispense with the confidentiality that sits within them and actually be much more open to scrutiny and public awareness.
How would you have liked to have seen that actioned?
So the bill is obviously going through Parliament at the moment. We talked yesterday about holding gross misconduct hearings in public.
Yes.
And we talked about the benefits and potential disbenefits of doing that. We also, the bill, I believe, still that it may have fallen, but it may also contain the option of legally qualified chairs, particularly for chief officers who are going through the misconduct process. Again, bringing that knowledge, that experience, that understanding from outside of policing into the conduct space, along with, obviously, time-served police officers as well, again, I think is a way of enhancing public confidence, but actually ensuring that the standards that we're setting are fit for purpose in 2024 for the behaviours and conduct, particularly of our most senior colleagues.
Thank you. Can I move on to the final section of recommendations? It relates to the body of our independent public advocate. So if we move down the page, it's section 3. Independent public advocate. We welcome the creation of the roles of the standing and incident-specific advocates for victims of major incidents. If implemented correctly, the advocates who fulfil those roles will provide crucial help to victims navigating the often daunting maze of rules and procedures that follow major incidents. And there's talk of this in this section. I'm interested to what extent, if any, you had contemplated the possibility of an independent public advocate assisting victims, families from navigating a significant or major incident.
So that's not something that I personally had given, had really engaged with that concept, but I know how labyrinthine the sort of legal system can be, how difficult it can be to navigate if you're outside of it rather than inside of it. So any independent advice and support for families, individuals who are working through what can be, as we discussed yesterday, Council, very, very lengthy processes, I would be very, very supportive of.
Thank you. Can we move on to paper SBPI 00614? And this is a document that's been prepared by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. SBPI 00614. And it's headed up submissions to the Sheku Bio Inquiry, the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Well, while we wait for that to come on the screen, I have a hard copy and I'll read this out. You've already mentioned the public sector equality duty today. And this is also known as the general equality duty. So we've heard reference to some of this being PSED or the general equality duty. And it was set out in the Equality Act 2010. And you're familiar with this. And it's the general duty requires public authorities in the exercise of their functions to have due regard to the need to eliminate unlawful discrimination, harassment and victimisation, and other prohibited conduct. Here we are. If we look at page 6, please. And we'll see some bullet points in bold. Yes, page 6, general equality duty. I've just read out what that is in the bullet points I was going through. So, eliminate unlawful discrimination, as I said. Advance equality of opportunity between people who share a relevant protected characteristic and those who do not share it. Foster good relations between people who share a protected characteristic and those who do not. And so that there are other elements, but if we look at those primarily, and then if I can turn to page 11, please. And I'd like to look at a bullet point at the bottom, towards the bottom of that page. A public authority must take responsibility. for complying with the general equality duty in relation to all functions to which the general equality duty applies. Responsibility for the general equality duty cannot be delegated to external organisations that are carrying out functions on its behalf. And then on page 12, although a public authority is not legally required to keep records of its consideration of the needs of the general equality duty in making decisions, it is good practice to do so, and it encourages transparency. Now, and towards the bottom of that page, the duty applies to all of the decisions made in the course of exercising public functions, not just to policy development and high-level decision-making. We've heard some evidence throughout the inquiry that there may be some, for example, there may have been some confusion regarding the extent to which the duties applied, and the Chair's heard evidence about that. Now, I think from what you've said to us yesterday and today, you're very clear that this duty applies to Police Scotland.
Yes.
And it has done since 2010.
Yes.
And are you satisfied, at least during your tenure, that this public sector equality duty, the general equality duty, was being observed in relation to decisions being taken, policies being introduced, standard operating procedures being taught, that equality duty was being observed by Police Scotland?
To the best of my knowledge, I think yes, the general equality duty was being observed by Police Scotland. There has always been an awareness of the general equalities duty, the equalities outcomes that Police Scotland sign up to. We have reported publicly on the discharge of those equalities outcomes. What I would say though, Council, is that we're not resting on our laurels at all here, and that again is part of our determination to become a properly anti-racist organisation, is not to take any policy or procedure for granted. And again, you will see within the EDI strategy that one of the outcomes in the one of the actions in the strategy is actually to consistently to go back and to review policies and processes and practices to ensure that they remain fit for purpose, they don't unwittingly discriminate against anybody with a protected characteristic, and that they remain fit for purpose in 2024.
So if things have fallen through the net and they haven't carried out equality impact assessments, for example, is that the type of thing that's going to be checked as part of the Policing Together programme?
So Police Scotland introduced, now I can't give you an exact date, but Police Scotland was amongst the forerunners in introducing equality impact assessments into the review and the setting up any new policy or practice or force procedure. Whether those equality impact assessments have always been carried out as rigorously or in as much detail as they could or should have been, again, we want to learn from that. We want to make sure that, to your point, has anything slipped through the net, then we catch that, we review that, we go back through it, and we ensure that the equality impact assessment, which is aligned with every policy, practice or procedure, is fit for purpose in 2023, 2024 moving forward. But what I would say is, as an organisation, we have been aware of our responsibilities under the Equalities Act, and also we have been actively completing equality impact assessments for a number of years now.
And will that include what we've heard described as the OST manual, so Officer Safety Training Manual? Will that be included in relation to a review of whether a full and detailed equality impact assessment has been carried out?
I'm sure it will be, Council. Again, I'm sure we have that documentation available, but my understanding is that yes, that should have been carried out. Operational safety training in particular, you know, when officers potentially exercise their coercive powers, it's more important in that environment probably than in any other to ensure that an equality impact assessment has been carried out.
And that will presumably include the use of force, where the force may include restraint, sprays, batons, and look at any elements of disproportionality.
That's absolutely correct. And the other aspect there as well, and certainly in my tenure in Police Scotland, we have enhanced the Scottish Police Emergency Life-Saving training for our officers as well. We have overhauled that training. And again, what have we achieved over the last few years? That is one element, again, where I feel the operational safety training has improved and our emergency life-saving has as well.
And as with other things, you've been very willing to provide the inquiry with further information, specifically in regard to training and training in relation to restraint. Would you be willing to provide us with further information about any equality impact assessment on the issue of restraint?
So again, you will understand if I pass that question on to colleagues who are currently serving, but I can't see any, personally, I can't see any problem at all in providing that documentation to you. I think that's entirely appropriate.
Thank you. And then I'd like to move on to the specific duties, because we've been talking about the general duty. Could we look at the same document at page 14, please? And if we look at the top, it says the specific duties. And again, these were created by secondary legislation under the Equality Act 2010, and the regulations were from 2012, coming into force in May 2012. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we move down the page, and again, who is subject to these specific duties, and it says many of the authorities that are subject are also covered by the specific duties. And is it fair to say that Police Scotland is one of the organisations that requires to comply with the specific duties also?
I think so, Council, but...
That's what I've been told.
Yeah.
Thank you. Can we look at page 15? Each authority is required to comply with the specific duties, and these duties include the following: to report on mainstreaming the equality duty, to publish equality outcomes and report progress, to assess and review policies and practices, to gather and use employee information, and to publish in a manner that is accessible. And from your awareness of the specific duties, is this something that we're Police Scotland?
We do.
Where
We do.
you're
And
doing that?
now, whether that report is required annually or biannually, again, I can't quite remember, but we report very regularly. I suspect it might be annually, or it might actually be the 4-year. It might be at the 4-year stage. As I say, I'm not 100% clear in my own mind about the reporting frequency, but we do report on exactly those bullet points in a equality in terms of the specific duties. That report, I think, may actually, it certainly goes to the SPA, it may also go to the Scottish Parliament, but we will have those reports.
Now, as I understand it, the inquiry have been seeking information from Police Scotland about employee information, but there's been some sort of difficulty. Are you aware of a difficulty in Police Scotland regarding this specific duty to gather and use employee information?
No, I'm not.
No.
I'm not aware specifically of that, Council.
Right, all right. And from what you've said, if you're publishing in a manner that is accessible, I think you said that was through the government and the SPA?
I don't know. I know we have a statutory responsibility to produce a report. Ultimately, you'll have to forgive me, I'm just not 100% clear in my own mind about where that report goes, but it is, I'm pretty sure, a public-facing report. We can, again, check all of that detail.
We could check that,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. I'd like to ask you about whistleblowing. You mentioned, and I referred you to your inquiry statement earlier this morning, we can take that off the screen, that you had talked about challenging poor and inappropriate behaviour and encouraging officers
Yes.
to do so. And do you consider, from your own knowledge, of the barriers that exist to officers or people reporting inappropriate or racist behaviour? And is there a policy or a standard operating procedure within Police Scotland that would deal with that type of scenario?
So in terms of whistleblowing, we have quite a mature sort of process for whistleblowers, for those who want to make protected disclosures. And we use, I say we, I'm getting my tense wrong, forgive me. There is a third party involved in ensuring that that Police Scotland's whistleblowing procedures are effective and are independent and are accessible. Again, that was one of the recommendations made by Dame Eilish. Again, the action tracker that we discussed yesterday, Council will give you a better understanding of exactly how we have discharged our responsibilities in terms of whistleblowing. But in terms of the ability to report behaviour that is inappropriate towards any colleague, we have tried to ensure that there are, again, a number of opportunities, a number of different ways of enabling colleagues to do just that. The non-statutory, the diversity staff associations are a key aspect of that. Colleagues can go to the LGBT Plus Association or to SEMPER or to the Disability and Carers Association and talk about the reaction they've received or the behaviours they've been subject of. Because, again, one of the things that I did do when I was in service was ensure that each one of those non-statutory diversity staff associations had a named chief officer aligned with it. So the non-statutory staff associations, such as SEMPER, such as the Muslim Police Association, such as the LGBI Police Association, can go directly and without impediment to a chief officer, generally in the rank of ACC, although I took that responsibility for race, to say, look, a colleague has reported this to me and we need to do something about it. So those lines of reporting, I think, have been sort of firmed up, if you like, over the last couple of years to ensure that nobody has to suffer in silence.
Right. And is there actually a policy that is accessible to officers that could be obtained?
I'm sure
again, I think there's been a request made, but we've not been able to get a copy.
Again, if we're in the space of the whistleblowing policy,
Yes.
then yes, I see no reason why that can't be provided to you, Council.
All right, thank you.
We'll
very much.
make sure that happens.
I'd like to move on to sort of final element in my questions, and this relates to the future for Police Scotland. What are the challenges and difficulties in affecting change in Police Scotland? It's a large organisation with many thousands of officers and staff. So could you help the Chair understand some of those challenges?
Yes, of course, and you know, one has to consider the external environment when you consider the internal environment within an organisation such as Police Scotland. You know, I would look particularly at the financial settlement on Police Scotland. When I spent those 2.5 months as the interim chief constable, I spent most of that time wrestling with a £19.4 million projected overspend. So that, you know, that attempting to balance the books, officer numbers across the piece, the demands on Police Scotland to step into the space occupied potentially by, or that should be occupied potentially by, other organisations and services as a consequence of austerity means that, you know, our policing response is being spread quite thinly, Council. So a real challenge actually is to provide our officers with the time and the space, and actually to ensure that they feel that it is legitimate for them to take the time to train, to take the time to educate themselves, to take the time to understand how they can comport themselves in the best possible way, because actually our people, Police Scotland's people, are under inordinate stress and inordinate pressure. The Durham University Business School staff survey, which was completed, I think, in 2021, spoke about the incredibly high public service ethos that exists within police officers and police staff in Scotland. It's a study which enables us to compare police services across the country, so there are benchmarks. And our people came out incredibly well in terms of that public service ethos, but what that means is that they exhaust themselves. You know, they get very, very tired trying to provide the quality of service that the vast, vast majority of our people feel is their responsibility to deliver to communities across Scotland. So there are the issues around the funding settlement, there are issues around officer numbers, there are issues around the responsibilities that police officers and members of police staff take on from potentially other organisations. And again, I should probably have mentioned when I said that mental health being key amongst those. And we would never, organisationally, as Police Scotland, never walk away from somebody in their moment of need. We just would not do that. You know, Section 32 of the Police and Fire Reform Act. However, you know, we do acknowledge that there is a responsibility on other agencies and organisations who can actually deal with people in crisis potentially better than we can. So there are those external barriers as well. And just looking back into the organisation, as I say, the general busyness of policing in Scotland, the general day-to-day responsibilities and demands on every single person within the organisation, which is why it's so important, I think, that the chief officer team, from the chief constable downwards, is absolutely focused. Sir Ian said, you know, legal, moral, operational, absolute responsibility to effect cultural change. Because again, if you look at our organisation, it makes absolute sense that we keep as many people healthy, well, in the workforce and feeling valued and able to deliver a service as we possibly can. And that, if we get the cultural change element of policing together right, is what we should be able to do. So actually, you know, a healthy, fit, valued and performing workforce will deliver the quality of service across our communities, you know, that we would hope to deliver. But it's a really busy environment. I am incredibly, you know, grateful to the new Chief Constable for, you know, ensuring that there is still a dedicated ACC to take policing together forward, because I do think that is the vehicle. It will change, it will develop, it will evolve. It needs to be rigorously evaluated, but Police Scotland needs to continue to progress the Policing Together programme to ensure that that culture change happens, you know, in days, weeks, months, years moving forward.
Picking up on one thing you've said there in relation to mental health, and the police will not leave anyone in need. There was some relatively recent publicity about the situation in the Met. The Commissioner was talking about financial restraints and concerns such that, and I'm simply summarising news that I've read, that officers in the Met would no longer respond to mental health incidents, and they would focus on policing rather than mental health. Now, as I understand it, that's not the position of Police Scotland.
No, that's certainly, when I retired from Police Scotland, that was absolutely not the position of Police Scotland. We have Section 32, as you know, Council of the Police and Fire Reform Act, which puts upon us an obligation for this safety and well-being of, I think it's people, places and communities in Scotland. And, you know, dealing with people who are in mental health crisis is certainly part of, you know, I think our obligations under Section 32. However, there is a difference between, you know, responding to somebody who is in desperate straits in the middle of the night, potentially when no other agency is available to support them or their family, and then potentially a police officer having to sit for a number of hours with that individual in an A&E environment waiting for them to be seen. So certainly in terms of back end, I think there is more that could be done. But, you know, I know that other public sector organisations are, you know, also dealing with their own sort of issues in Scotland, and I would never. This isn't any kind of, well, it's, you know, it's your fault. It's not. That's just a statement of reality, I think. But, you know, there is certainly something about, well, what does the back end of that support to a person in extremis look like? But I don't think Police Scotland would. I hope Police Scotland would never walk away from a person in, you know, dire need.
So in terms of Police Scotland moving forward, there's no expectation that there would be a refusal to deal with someone who was in mental health crisis?
So I can only speak for my time in Police Scotland Council. That, again, I think is possibly a question which is best put to somebody who is still serving, and will be able to give you an absolute, up to the minute sort of understanding of exactly where the organisation sits in respect of mental health.
Thank you. One last thing that's been drawn to my attention. I wonder if we could have a look at a memorandum of understanding, which is between the PERC, the Police Scotland, and the Scottish Police Authority. Here it is, PERC 04436. Now, if we look at page 3 of the PDF, we'll see that this is dated the 31st of July. Sorry, if we go. It's maybe not the PDF number, maybe that's 2. Dated the 31st of July 2020. So it was not in place in 2015. This is the current, as I understand it, memorandum of understanding. Were you aware of this memorandum of understanding when you were in post?
I may have been aware of it, Council, but I can't claim to have any, at this point in time, detailed understanding of its, or detailed recollection of its content.
I'm interested in Appendix D, which, in terms of the page numbers on the hard copy I've been given, that's 35. So it will be round about that on the PDF. We can see the page numbers at the bottom of the page as they go by. That's C, so if we can move on to Appendix D. Sharing of information between Police Scotland, the Authority, the PERC and the Crown Office in conduct matters. So this would appear to relate to that sharing of information between all of those organisations regarding conduct, which was a matter part of your portfolio. Information may be provided with the prosecutor's consent to PSD or the authority for the purpose of conduct or misconduct proceedings. Such information will advise PSD or the authority of the nature of any allegations at the outset, advise if there is likely to be additional offences, and of the evidence at the conclusion of the investigation and following a decision by the Crown Office to prosecute or not. During an investigation, if there are any significant developments that substantially weakens or strengthens the case against the officer, member of staff or member of the authority's staff, the timing and disclosure of such information will be discussed and agreed with the Crown Office to ensure that the ongoing investigation and any potential criminal proceedings are not compromised. Such information will be provided on a confidential basis solely for the purpose of conduct considerations and not for any other purpose such as civil proceedings. So I've read that out to you, obviously it was in place in 2020. Does that refresh your memory now that you look at that? There was obviously this memorandum of an understanding. Can you think of any examples where there was this shared information?
No, I can't. That doesn't mean that there weren't any, and again, that's possibly a question which is better put to the ACC professionalism, who would be,
ACC Spears.
It was ACC Spears at the time, yeah. But the kind of key, I suppose, element of the first paragraph there is, information may be provided with the prosecutor's consent. So I can't, off the top of my head, Council, think of any examples of that, but that doesn't mean that there haven't been any.
Right. There's no recollection of that being relied on to seek information as far as you're aware?
I honestly, I couldn't, I'm not dissembling, I just could not speak to that because I don't know.
All right, thank you. Could you give me a moment, please?
Certainly.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Are there any Rule 9 applications? Ms Mitchell, anybody else? Mrs. Taylor, would you mind withdrawing to the witness room while I hear a submission?
So
Yes.
there are three issues. The first is in relation to the Gold Group membership, and the witness in her evidence stated that this Gold Group, the first meeting took place relatively soon after, and so she was inheriting a legacy gold, and then in due course the SPF did not attend. So of course that's correct. She arrived in July 2018, and September 2018 was that meeting. However, some 9 months later, on 29th March 2019, two members of the Scottish Police Federation attended, David Kennedy, who had attended before, but also Amanda Given. Now, as the inquiry will recall, Amanda Given gave evidence to this inquiry on day 18. She was present on the day in question in the room where the police officers were put together. She was the Fed rep, and her discussions taking place, and was interviewed as a witness by Perk for reference, that's 000237. And the inquiry may recall she was the person to whom Nicole Short was said to have flagged up the mark on her vest. What I would like to ask this witness is, standing these factors, had she been aware of her involvement, would she have been comfortable with her presence in these meetings? And if not, why not? In relation to the same document, in relation to Gold Group, there is mention at page 11 of 26 that when a report is being made to Crown Office in respect of possible criminality, there is an agreed template or subject report. And what I was wondering was if she knew of that subject report, had she seen one, and whether or not that document has anything inside it that might give any indication on, for example, staying proceedings until outcome of Crown Office investigations. I say that whilst there is a backlog of race disclosure that we're going through, but to date I don't think I've seen any document which flags up these agreed template or subject report between Police Scotland and Crown Office. The third issue that I would like to address is the issue of risk in that same document. There's a report by Lucy Adamson in relation to publicity, and in that context there is a heading number 7 which relates to risk, and in that Mr. Anwar, solicitor for the family of Mr. Bio, is identified as, it would appear, at risk. Now, this inquiry knows, and will no doubt hear in future if the media is covered as a particular issue, that there were other bodies that spoke in relation to the police, namely PERC, Kate Frame, and the Scottish Police Federation. So what I would like to ask of this witness, who was chairing the meeting where this document presented, was why she thought that it was only the solicitor to the Sheikh Bio family was identified in this way, and if, reflecting on this issue, ought the Scottish Police Federation and PERC also have been included as part of that consideration. Those are my questions.
Yes, very well. I shall allow you to ask these questions.
I'm obliged.
Can we have the witness back, please?
Yes.
Mrs. Taylor, Ms. Mitchell KC, who represents the families of Sheku Bayo, has some questions for you. Ms. Mitchell.
You said in your evidence earlier today, when asked about Gold Group membership, that you took an inheritance, a legacy Gold Group, and you said in due course the SPF did not attend. I wonder if we can have document up PS 05673. That's the Gold Group meetings. We've seen that earlier today and yesterday. Whilst those are being brought up, thank you very much. Whilst those are being brought up, we see that your first meeting was on the 18th September 2018. Now, you'd arrived in July of the 2018, so this was a relatively short period of time after you'd arrived. And if we scroll down, that we see present there, as you've already been asked about, is Scottish Police Federation David Kennedy, yes. And he'd phoned in. I wonder if we can scroll down, please, to the next meeting, which is identified, and I believe that's some 9 months after you joined, if we can continue down. Here we go. This is the 29th March 2019, and we see that you're chairing that. There are two representatives from the Scottish Police Federation, David Kennedy and Amanda Given. Now, this inquiry has heard that Amanda Given was in fact present on the day of the incident of Sheku Bayo back at the police station. And the inquiry has heard of evidence that she's been able to provide in respect of her recollections that day. And those include providing information which could be of evidential value, such as whether or not Nicole Smith presented to her a vest, whether or not there was a mark on that vest, the comings and goings in and out of the room, who spoke to who, what their conversation was. Now, were you aware at the time of that interview, firstly, on 29th March 2019, that Amanda Given was somebody that the PIRC had interviewed in relation to this matter and had been present on the day?
So I wasn't aware that the PIRC had interviewed Amanda Given. I do, counsel, think I do recollect that Amanda was the SPF representative at the time, but in terms of her status with PIRC, I couldn't say definitively whether I realised or recognised that she had been interviewed or a statement taken from her by the PIRC.
Well, a statement had been taken from her by the PIRC. If you had been aware of the fact that a statement had been taken from her in relation to PIRC, and given the fact any questions of criminality in respect of police officers had still been pending, would you have been comfortable with her presence in these meetings?
I think that's a very fair question, counsel, and I think certainly with the benefit of sitting where I am now, the answer is no.
And can you explain why that is?
Well, I think that what we would always want to do is to eliminate any potential for conflict. And if an individual is personally involved in any kind of set of circumstances or situation, then in terms of protecting them as an individual, but also in terms of protecting the integrity of any conversation or conversations that may take place, trying to eliminate any potential for conflict, I think, is good practice.
And that potential would have been present because she was present at these hearings?
Potentially, yes.
Moving on, please, can I move on to page 11 of 26 on my PDF? Unfortunately, these aren't. If you can just scroll down, and if you can stop there, please. I'm not going to ask you in any detail about this meeting that took place on the 18th of February 2019, but I want to ask you about a certain document that's said to be in place. Can you see here that at line 3 it says the Lord Advocate Guidelines regarding complaints about the police, Regulation 9 of the Police Service of Scotland Conduct Regulations 2014, and indeed the Reform Act all provide guidance or direction in relation to allegations which amount to criminality. Police Scotland are obliged to report such matters to CAAPD at COPFS and do not record a crime as such, but simply report it by way of an agreed template or subject report. This is to ensure we fulfil their expectations of reporting allegations for their consideration. Now, there is specific reference there to Rule 9. Are you aware of such an agreed template or subject report being in place?
I genuinely am not, no.
No. Would you expect to have known about such an item?
I am struggling a little bit just to contextualise this at the moment. If it was a matter of absolute significance, then yes, I would have anticipated that I would have known about it, Council. But I can't recall whether such, as you say, a schedule was in place.
Yeah, I think this appears to speak in general terms, including Regulation 9 of the Police Service, to indicate that there should, and such, simply reported by way of an agreed template or subject report, but you're not aware of such a document.
So if it existed within Police Scotland, it would have existed within Police Scotland. I can't summon it to mind. I couldn't describe to you what that template looked like.
But you would have expected to see it if such a thing existed?
I would have expected that if we said such a thing existed, then yes, we certainly had it.
Would you have expected to have seen it in your role?
Potentially. Potentially. I can't say definitively whether I would have done or not. If there were action owners assigned to or aligned with these particular recommendations, it may have been the case that if the action owner was sufficiently senior and that person assured me that yes, this schedule or this report or template existed, then I would have taken them on their word. So can't say definitively that I would have expected to see it.
I wonder if we can move on to my next area, which is further on in this document, if we can scroll down, please. And continue to go. What we're looking for is the Lucy Adamson report in relation to media. Here we are. Now, we see that this is a document which was first created on the 16th of November, but there's an iterative process ongoing, and it would appear at this time it's being presented at a meeting which you have chaired, and appears to have been last updated 1st October 2018. As we can see at part 2, if we can scroll down slightly, the terms of the reference for the goal group aim to maintain confidence in Police Scotland, and then it goes into specific terms of how to do that. I wonder if we can go down to paragraph 7, please. If we can stop there, that's fine, thank you. Can we see under the heading risks? The events of May 2015 and the ongoing PERC COPFS investigation present a risk to maintaining public confidence in policing. Clear and timely communication will assist with mitigating the impact of this. However, this has been restricted by the ongoing investigations. Now, in the next few paragraphs, we see that the person who is identified, the only individual who is identified in relation to this, what is described as risk, is the deceased family's lawyer. And it indicates that he also represents families of other people, and it also goes on to talk about terrorist attack, including, once again, the deceased family lawyer. And if you scroll down, I think we can see in full the deceased family lawyer, again, in the next paragraph, has drawn comparison to the lack of answers while the PERC investigation continues a year after the death. Questions have been raised regarding the integrity of police officers, etc. And the view taken by the writers, the issue should be addressed through work with safer communities to prepare for such a claim about integrity of police officers and set of key messages prepared to respond to any future criticisms. Were you aware at the time of this second meeting, that would be in 2019, some 9 months after you'd taken post, that there were other people who had in public addressed matters which may be considered either critical or calling questions about Police Scotland? Can you remember any other bodies that might have been involved in that?
In respect of the
In
events
respect of the events of Shukabayo?
2015. I can't recall at this point in time, but that doesn't mean that that there weren't sort of public criticism or public concern aired, Council.
If the chair were to find that there were, for example, press in relation to Park, in relation to Kate Frame, in relation to the Scottish Police Federation, and those raised issues which might be considered, inverted commas, as risk to Police Scotland in this way, ought they have been included in such a report?
I understand your question now. Yes, absolutely, they should have been,
Yeah.
and that's it shouldn't have focused simply on one individual and the responsibilities of that individual. Absolutely, should have taken a much more holistic approach to risk.
And were you aware at the time of those criticisms? I'm asking to go back and now ask in 2019, but
yeah. I'm sure I would have been, given that I was I'm sure I would have been, given that I was chairing the goal group. I can't remember them in detail, but I should have. Even if I wasn't aware, I should have been aware.
and on reflection, that being the case, ought that to have been flagged
We should have
up?
we should have expanded or changed, to ensure that all of the risks potentially arising were recorded. No question.
No further questions.
Thank you. Mrs Taylor, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry and for all the work that you've done in connection with the inquiry. We're going to rise for lunch now and you'll then be free to go.
Thank you.
We'll sit again at 2 o'clock.